want to welcome everybody to the Nashua Historical Society and to come to hear our wonderful speaker today. My name is Janice Franco, and Paula, can you stand up, please? Paula Lockhead and I are co-curators of the bridal exhibit, and we want to welcome you. We hope you enjoy your time here today. I want to talk about Elaine and let you know that she writes knowledge-inspired adventure fiction that includes the Dark Apostle series about medieval surgery. And the author there is Elaine, except she goes by E.C. Ambrose. And the Bone Guard archaeological thrillers, also by E. Chris Ambrose. She's the frequent workshop instructor and former adventure guide who makes wearable art in her free time. And you can see some of that, which is very exciting. We're all really excited about that. Her latest adventure is about an interactive superhero novel, Sky Strike, Wings of Justice for Choice of Games. And that's the name of the series. Yeah. Okay. And on that note, I will hand the mic over to Elaine Isaak. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you for having me. So today's talk is going to be about interactions between fantasy and fashion, mostly by way of the kinds of things that I make and do. But of course, in order to do that, we're going to begin with a story. Once upon a time, long ago, when my ancestors first came to America, a woman who became known as Old Mother Hicks moved into an area near Gloucester, Massachusetts called Dogtown, which you may have heard about. There were a couple of books that came out about Dogtown. And she would go out by the sea and wait for her husband and later her sons to return from the sea, where they were fishermen and whalers. And in order to do that, she had made herself a long cloak with a thick hood that came up over her head to protect her from the New England weather as she walked. Well, she lived for a very long time, and eventually that long cloak, the hem got a little ratty, the way that they do, and the hood started to wear down a little bit. And when her son was going off to found his own household, moving into an area of Pennsylvania called the Wyoming River Valley, she took that old cape of hers and she cut it a little bit smaller and a little bit closer and cut off those areas that were kind of worn out and gave it to him to take into his new life. So he lived there quite happily with his family for a long time. They survived a variety of raids sponsored by the French that became the French and Indian Wars. And eventually his son was moving out and moving a little bit further south. Now by this time he had been wearing that cape that his mother had made for a long time, and the hem had gotten worn out and some of the seams were wearing through. And so he had it recut and sewn into a greatcoat that his son could wear when he went off to war. Well, his son wore that coat through several battles, which thankfully he survived until eventually he was able to move west and found his own family. And by that time, that coat, well, it had been through a lot, as you know. Kids, especially soldiers, can be rough on their clothing. But when he had a son, he had it recut and made a little shorter, didn't have a hood anymore, there wasn't quite enough fabric for that. And his son wore that jacket for a long time, and it kept him warm, especially because he kept close the memory of his family going back through these many generations. Eventually, he had a son who was leaving home, and he wanted to send with him something to take from his home. And so he brought out the remain of that jacket, which, the sleeves were kind of worn out. At that point, the collar was all done in, but there was enough fabric there, just enough, to make a vest that he could wear to his new life on the West Coast. Well, by the time that vest came down to my grandfather, It was pretty ratty. There was a little fabric left, so that when he went to college at Colorado, the University of Colorado Boulder, his mother made for him a vest that was just the front, and the back was fitted. But the front was this antique piece of fabric that had been in the family by now for many, many generations. And when his son, my father, was ready to leave home, boy, there was not much left. But he had enough left to make a pocket. And sewed that pocket on the inside of a coat so that my dad could carry pencils and business cards off into his new life. Sadly, when it came down to me, that pocket had all worn out, and there was just enough left to tell this story. Thank you. So I'm a storyteller. Mostly now I tell my stories in the form of books that you can buy just about anywhere, including here afterwards, if you are interested. And sometimes I tell my stories through fabric. I make wearable art designs. These are some of them. Using felting, dyeing, and hand weaving techniques. I have 2 floor looms at home right now, and we're going to be talking more about weaving, I guess, later on. There's a little bit of weaving in the samples that are going around, but probably more felting. I tend to make samples before making the felted garments, so that's where those come from. You'll hear more about some of these pieces. My sister is in the middle there. You're going to see a lot of pictures of my family. There's a reason why my story, when I begin, also includes my family, because they're here. So my sister, you'll note, is wearing a jacket that is hand-woven in the center and then hand-dyed at the sides. And those scraps of hand-woven fabric are also in the coat that I'm wearing. And then there's the fantasy part. I began as a fantasy novelist, but I do frequently write into other genres. So my most recent book is a young adult science fiction novel, my first in that genre. And then I write a lot of archaeological adventure novels, which do sometimes include some fiber arts things. There's a basket that was critical in the second book, for example. So where did I come from? Why am I here now? When I was a little kid, I collected stuffed animals. That was my big passion. And at that time, you couldn't really get anything except, teddy bears. And teddy bears, to me, are not all that interesting. So I learned to sew. My mother taught me to sew on her Singer sewing machine. And I started making my own original design stuffed animals, and most of the first ones were pretty goofy looking. As you could imagine, I was starting when I was about 8 or 9 years old. And then eventually I had my own business, Curious Characters, where I was making and selling those critters through the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen. And the greeling, this little character sitting off to the side here, is one of my more popular creations in that guise. The one in the middle is another story and fiber arts piece. I don't know if the dragon is reading about the woman, or if the woman is reading about the dragon, or maybe both. And then the last one is a picture of me cosplaying as Elisha Barber, the main character from my dark historical fantasy series about medieval surgery. So I went to the Rhode Island School of Design after attending Hollis Area High School, back when it was Hollis Area High School. And I was at RISD for 2.5 years, eventually decided that perhaps sinking $30,000 that time was a lot of money. Nowadays it's a lot more. Into art school was perhaps not the best use of my resources. But it was after I came home that I founded Curious Characters. That's sort of where I came from. So when I was at RISD, I was a sculpture major. People often assume that I was in either a textile major or actually in fashion design. But the sculpture crossover is pretty significant. When I'm making a garment, I'm also thinking about basically sculpting that fabric to fit around the form, which is the human body. My weaving began in New Hampshire with an instructor called Connie Gray, who is very famous in New Hampshire weaving circles. She used to teach at the Sharon Arts Center out in Peterborough. And this coat is sort of infamous because when I took her weaving workshop, I was pregnant. And she joked that I got a little bit further away from the loom each week. But definitely the project had a deadline by which I needed to finish. And now a word from our sponsors. For a long time, I made animal mascot costumes for a business out of Londonderry, New Hampshire, sadly closed. The Burger King French fries, they were redesigning their French fries, and they wanted to celebrate that at a big sort of sales and marketing meeting in Vermont. And it was the following week. So they called us up and said, well, can you make us 2 French fry box costumes that show the new design for the French fry box for this big sales and marketing conference? And we said, well, for enough money, yes. So that's my husband and me in front of our house in Wilton, celebrating the French fry box completion. The bad news is that that adhesive that you have to use on that kind of foam is kind of toxic, and I was getting kind of high by the end of it. It was a lot. It was a lot of French fries. So I think of what I do as narrative fashion, and most of my pieces as we go along, you'll see, have a story behind them. Some of them more explicitly than others. Some of them are inspired directly by works of fiction or by storytelling, and some of them sort of coordinate with those things, but there's usually a story to tell. So I begin with inspiration. I get an idea, maybe the story sparks something, maybe it's the materials. I move into design, thinking about how I want this thing to look, what structures I need, what is important to me about the idea that I have, and how I'm going to explore that idea. Creation. I start actually generating the patterns, cutting the fabric, designing, putting things together, and then revision. And it's very much the same with novels. I get an idea for a book. I think, oh, cool, this is going to be fun. Who are the characters going to be? Where is it set? I often will outline, so I'll set up a bunch of note cards. Moving into the design process, I'll start drafting, and then I revise. How many of you out there sew or make things? Yeah, a lot of you. So the first 3 are pretty familiar, right? We all get inspired by something, we design the thing, we start making it. Revision, I think, is the area where a lot of people who sew or who make don't necessarily think about the possibilities for revising, for how to take a thing that you've made or begun to make and make changes to it so that it's closer to your vision for the work. And that's a lot of what I'm going to focus on today. Various inspirations. That's my friend LJ. She's a fellow author. She's actually done some of the formatting for my books, and she likes the barter system. So I made her a vest inspired by the Milky Way, because she has a property called Starfield Farm. And then we have this kind of crazy dragon cape, which is actually hanging over here. That was one where I found the fabric at Joann's on sale. I thought, this is kind of crazy and fascinating, and I think I could felt on it. So I did. Some pieces from my design wall. Some of these little samples are going around now, so if you hadn't gotten a chance to touch them, you will get a chance to do so later. So The Bastard Queen was the 3rd book in my first fantasy series, and when it was coming out to the launch, I wanted to make something special to celebrate. That is a tunic, asymmetrical tunic that is entirely hand-dyed. It's bamboo fabric. There's a lot of fun sort of figuring out how to make flame shapes that echoed the flame structure of the cover of the book. Of course, the book now has a new cover, so that's how these things go. Revision. Exactly. Well, if you think about the origin of that word, right? To do again, vision. To see it again, or to see it in a different way. As I'm thinking about design, I'm looking at different patterns and silhouettes. I'm thinking about weave structures, if I'm going to be weaving. That also applies to different kinds of fabric. If I'm going to be making something from commercial fabric, then is it going to be a woven fabric? Is cotton appropriate? Do I want silk? Will I be dyeing or over-dyeing the piece of fabric, and how will that affect the look of the finished piece? Are there other fiber arts tools that I want to use and techniques? We were talking a little bit earlier about needle felting, Nuno felting, which is a lot of what I do, and combining those techniques often into the same garment. I also need to consider draping is one of the processes that people often use when creating fashions. Draping basically means that you have a form that you are literally placing the fabric over to see the lines, to see how the fabric moves in different directions, because the bias is different from the straight grain of the fabric. So often during the inspiration phase, if I have a material that I want to work with, I will drape it over my dummy and just live with it for a while. I'll just look at it hanging there and go, how is this hanging? How can I envision this now being on the body, moving through space? This is also when I'll do my dyeing and shrinkage tests. If I know kind of what I want to do, then I'll go through a lot of iterations to see, well, can I get the color that I want? If I'm using a resist technique that we'll talk about a little later with the ancients dress, I did a lot of different dye batches with that and then tried different resist techniques to get the different images to show up the way that I wanted them to. And material play. A lot of this for me, whether I'm writing or creating a garment, is playtime. It's let me get in there with the stuff, with the part of this that I enjoy, and just mess around and see what happens. So I think play is important, and it's a phase that we often leave out of our work, especially if you get sort of serious about it, or if you start entering shows and things, then suddenly it feels like a job that has to be done, and it has to be serious, and it has to be important, and more important, it has to be perfect. Which, as we know, it very rarely is. Hence, revision. So these are some of the patterns that live in my collection. These are ones I haven't actually used yet. I have a kindred spirit in the back row. But it's fun every so often when I will create a new fabric on the loom, or I'll start thinking about a garment, I pull out those patterns and I look them over. Say, are there aspects of this that I can use? Sometimes I end up draping and just doing that for my patterning. There's no pattern involved. I'm literally cutting and sewing the fabric from the dummy, and that ends up being the finished garment. One of the things about it is that it's an iterative process. I don't think about the work as being one and done, from the inspiration to the completion. The weaver Daryl Lancaster says that if you have finished a project without thinking about a way you could have done it better, then you haven't learned anything. I was like, that's interesting. Because I used to hit that phase where I think I'm done, and then I go, oh, God, I really wish I had. And then I feel like I've failed, or I've done something wrong, instead of thinking, oh, this is a successful project, and next time I do something similar, I can handle this differently, or I can do it better isn't often the right word, but I can improve on my approach or use a different approach that might achieve better result closer to what I think. So I usually think of myself as an ambitious beginner, even though I've been doing this since high school, because most of the stuff that I do I wasn't formally trained for. I found a thread, I pulled on it, and then I pursued it, and I chased it across the floor like a cat until I came up with what I needed to know. Sometimes I'll take workshops, or I'll get a lot of books and resources to fill in the parts that I don't know yet. So working with the process, weaving, felting, or finishing the actual cloth teaches me a lot more about the fabric. What is it that I really have now? Maybe I had a specific thing in mind. Maybe I did some tests, but then when I actually produced it, it didn't turn out quite the way that I had planned. And that's okay. So now I'm draping again. For those of you counting, this is the third time. To see, what do I have now that it is coming into being? This is often the time for laying out the pattern pieces, if I'm using a commercial pattern, cutting and construction, and then fitting. But it's in whatever order the vision calls for. The traditional thing is if you had gone to Joann's, you bought a piece of fabric, you bought a pattern, you go home, you pre-shrink your fabric, you lay out that pattern on the fabric, you cut the fabric, you make the thing, ta-da! In using especially handmade fabrics, but anytime you are custom creating something, whether it's for you or for a client, the process goes much more back and forth than that. Sometimes I'm cutting some pieces, but not all of them, because I know that I may change the shape of those pieces, because the fabric isn't going to drape as much as I want it to for particularly the fronts, some of the asymmetrical kinds of patterns that I like to use. you need a certain level of drape in the fabric. If you discover you don't do that, you may need to recut parts of the pattern, and it'll be a lot easier if you haven't cut everything out and then realize that my new piece will not fit with the old pieces that I've already made. So this piece is called Mountain Home, and there it is in progress. It is a Nuno felted jacket. I think I have more about this later on. But this is one where I fitted the shoulders of the jacket first, and then everything else followed on from that because of the structure of the visual that I was trying to create. So we'll see that later on. So revision is the play between the plan and the product, whether that's the outline or the idea that I had for a novel, and now I have a draft that I need to dig into and figure out what's actually going on there, or a garment that's not coming together quite the way that I had hoped. So when I'm revising something, I want to think about, what do I actually have? Not what did I have in my head, what did I want it to be, what is the vision that I had, but what is now a material object in front of me? What is the story that I have told on the page? What is the story that I have told in the fabric? And then, with the objective eye, as much as possible, how is it really working? All too often I've made the mistake of thinking, well, it's working well enough. It'll be fine. You know, when I finish these seams, when I put the collar on, it's going to be great. It's not. It's really not. If it's not fitting when it's not quite sewn, it's not going to suddenly start fitting properly when it is. There's always a stage where I am deeply disappointed. And it doesn't matter, again, if it's a book or a garment.
Are you hand sewing this stuff?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, okay.
Mostly I'm machine sewing. I do have an industrial sewing machine,
Okay.
so I can go through a lot of layers very fast. But often I'm using both, especially with anything Nuno felted. A lot of the Nuno felt, it gives a better look if I hand sew it, because I can follow the irregular edges of the felted pieces. So, okay, let's see, what else did we not cover? The sunk costs fallacy. This is an economic term, and basically it means if you're at the bottom of a hole, stop digging. Like, you know, the carpenters say measure once, cut twice. My grandfather used to say, well, you know, I keep cutting and cutting and it's still too short. If it's too short, stop cutting. But we forget that. We think, well, I'll keep working on it. I'll keep working on it. It'll be good. Sometimes you need to step back and go, what do I really need, though? If you're at the bottom of a hole, stop digging. It hurts to abandon your perfectly good plan in favor of what you actually have. I think a lot of us who have creative projects have found ourselves in that position where it is not, for whatever reason, not coming together the way that I envisioned. It helps to walk away, hang out with your friends, go to the bookstore, come visit the museum, take a break and return. Fabric and fantasy each have a life of their own, independent from me, their creator. A lot of times people talk, especially about the book writing process, as if they were giving birth to the book. And it is sort of like that. Fantasy, fabric, it's the same kind of thing. There's a point at which I made it, but it's not quite mine anymore. So when I am writing, one of the techniques that I use is called scene collision, where I'll take my note cards, my carefully planned note cards with my characters and my scenes in them, and I'll just shuffle them together. So they end up in a completely random order. And then I start dealing them out in that completely random order and see what new ideas can be sparked from the material that I already have. And sometimes I'll do the same thing with fabrics. So I know I have 3 or 4 fabrics that go together, but I'm not sure how I want to use them. Well, I'll try this one on the top, and then that one. I will drape this one. In one case, I ended up turning the fabric upside down on the dummy, and suddenly it worked. I was like, oh, I had one plan in mind. The fabric was doing something different. So we worked together and came up with a new plan. Fantasy always begins with reality for me, both in terms of making a garment where the reality is the human form that I'm trying to clothe, or researching stuff that I want to create a book about. So in this case, I am noodling around with a beaver head, trying to figure out how to make a beaver, because beaver broke. I don't know if you've seen this. I don't know if this particular beaver is still around. It's been a little while. But when they commissioned me to make their mascot, they wanted it to be a realistic beaver as much as possible with someone wearing it. So I had to think about the shape of the head and the color of the teeth. And if you look really closely, I actually made 2 different pairs of feet. So it's got one pair of feet which are meant for parade use that don't have claws. But they felt the claws were important, so they wanted to have clawed feet. And then the tail is sort of a big leather tail that can be tied up at the back. So in this case, I had to think about, well, what's essential? What are the most important things about my inspiration that I need to take into this project? And because I was working with a client, going back and forth with them and talking about what they felt was essential to capture. So a lot of my sketching was around that. Cape of Legend. This piece is actually hanging over there. This one is one of the explicitly narrative designs. It was inspired by a piece of cloth that I had that was from a collection for the Legends of King Arthur. I was like, oh, that's cool. Well, how would I tell the story of King Arthur, but in fabric? So I hit up on the idea of using the 4 seasons as you walk around the cloak, or as the cloak moves through space. There's tree at the front, which on one side is in spring, and on the other side is in winter. And then I used the giant dahlia quilt pattern to create the sky. The piece of fabric that you see over there that's sort of blue and has like wizards and knights and things on it, that was the piece that I originally started with. And that piece of fabric shows up a couple of times in the actual garment, sometimes using the characters, and then sometimes it's actually reversed, and it's in the sky. So when you get a chance later on, you can take a look and find that. So I was thinking about, well, what is the essence of this particular fantasy, this particular story? It's about romance and betrayal and battle and nobility, and also the idea that Arthur will rise again, which is one of the reasons why the cape in particular appealed to me, because I could get that sense of moving from the winter, the despair of the betrayal at the end of that Arthur story, back into a new spring. And this is the finished piece. So you can see on one side there's a few leaves coming out on the tree, and there's the sword in the stone. And on the other side, where it's winter, the shading of the sky has changed. And then if you look very closely at the kind of ruined castle there, there's actually a couple inside of it kissing. So we are, of course, here because there is a wedding show on. So ideas of romance are probably foremost in our mind. And there's a tournament on the back with knights and things. And the castle even changes character. The castle in summer is gold and bright, and then the castle in fall is sort of dark and foreboding. So I wanted to include a couple of weddings because we were going to talk about weddings and bridal gowns. This is the first wedding that I costumed. This couple met through the Society for Creative Anachronism, and they wanted to have a medieval wedding. So they had picked out some garment styles from the 15th century that they admired. They were coming from slightly different regions. His is sort of more Russian-inspired, but that's okay. It's their fantasy. So those are some of the pages from my sketchbook that shows what I was thinking about and taking notes when I talked to them about what they felt was important to capture from their garment inspirations to translate into the actual wedding garb that they wore. So this piece was inspired when a friend of mine was running the Wilton Arts and Film Festival. And she was talking to a bunch of us. I had a studio at that time at the Riverview Mill in Wilton, which is still there and still, I think, has open studios periodically. So a bunch of us were hanging out at lunch, and she said, well, I'm in charge of this, and what I'd really like to have happen is just have some, like, extraordinary things. I want to have magic in the streets. I was like, I am your girl. Let's do this. So at the time, I lived just up the hill. I could actually walk downtown. I walked to the library all the time. It was great. So I conceived of a way to bring fantasy to life for the people who were on the streets there. And this is a costume that's also a puppet. I'm a huge Jim Henson fan. I wanted to be Jim Henson when I was a kid. So, you know, all of the Muppet things and all of the puppet things. And there it is when it's finished. So my feet are actually going down through the snail shell, so I'm walking. There are fake legs at the front. The head of the snail, the reins are actually a pair of dowels. that have been painted, and then they have fringes on them, but that's actually how I direct the snail. So I can basically use the snail head as a giant puppet, and it can look around. And there were some llamas. Somebody had brought llamas because they were selling various llama products, I guess, you know. And the llamas were extremely concerned about this. I like the idea of bringing magic out into the world, especially to people who may not think about wonder in their daily lives. It's so easy to get ground down by expectations, and you know, you go to the grocery store, and then I got to go to the work, and you know, and then my kid needs something, and so part of my goal is to give people a moment where they go, oh, and maybe are jumped out of their daily life into something new. This was actually two pieces called Ancients, and they were inspired by the kind of petroglyphs that you see at the middle there. One of the things that was important to me to capture is the sense that history comes in many layers. And even on those walls, often there are older petroglyphs that have then been painted over by new Native Americans as they pass through the area in different time periods of indigenous life in Utah and Colorado. So these were some of the tests that I made in terms of figuring out the dyeing. I knew I would need at least two different fabrics to combine. One would be the base layer, and then I would want something that was thin and see-through on the top. So I had to use two different dye batches to create the layers in similar color ranges. And this is the one where I did a lot of experiments to figure out the resist, so that some parts of those fabrics would actually be clear or white. And you can see in this one, the handprint is on a separate layer of silk, and the spiral that you see underneath it is actually on the other layer of fabric. So parts of the garment have 3 different layers on them. So it was basically a jacket and then the dress, and I have the dress over here. It's a little bit harder to see in the pictures, but there's just all kinds of different sort of critters and layers going on in there. This was a piece that I was actually super happy with. Trying to think if there was a stage at which I was deeply disappointed, and probably there was, but... Second wedding. The second wedding was my sister's. My sister also met her husband through the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is a medieval recreation group. But when she talked about what she wanted in a dress, she didn't want something that was strictly a period creation. So I came up with this basic silhouette for her. There's the finished piece. She wanted to have the look of a train, but also to be able to dance and eventually to ride in her wedding dress. So the dress itself is 20 yards of silk charmeuse. It is self-lined. In order to achieve the effect of having a train without having all of that fabric attached to the dress, I made this long cape that you can see flowing out behind her. And then it was held on by a pair of silver pins that my parents bought for her. And that's actually me in my maid of honor dress. For each of the bridesmaids, she gave each of us 5 yards of the same fabric and told us we could make anything as long as it fell into the period of the Middle Ages, about the 12th century through the 16th century. So mine is sort of a classic 14th century princess kind of thing. And that's the back. My Aunt Karen made the embroidery of the Celtic horse. Now, it was a little bit tricky because her husband, his parents are both in the theater, and his dad was a costumer. So when they saw the sketch of Michelle's gown, they said, but mutton chop sleeves didn't come into use until the 18th century. So, well, yeah, but you know, that was the style that she wanted. She wanted the puff at the top and then the fitted lower sleeve. So yes, there are mutton chop sleeves, even though they didn't come into use until much later. My historian friends will hopefully forgive me. It's fantasy, yes. And your wedding is kind of your ultimate fantasy for a lot of us. It is a moment that we often have been hoping for, dreaming of for a very long time. So you want it to be the fulfillment of that fantasy. Starborn was my first fully Nuno felted piece. I love galaxies, any kind of nebulas. A couple of people here know me through a local science fiction readers group. So I'm definitely very much invested in that and the fantasy of space, if you will. So the intent behind Starborn was to make it entirely felted, and all of the fitting for it would be done using the felting technique. So it would shrink in particular ways, and theoretically it would shrink in the right way so that it would fit nicely without being too small or too tight. So the actual pieces, oh, I didn't think to bring one of my patterns. The pattern pieces you see laid out on the floor there are twice as large as they will be in the finished garment, because that is the level of shrinkage that you expect when you are putting felt onto something or wool onto something. If you ever put a wool sweater in the wash and dryer, you know what I'm talking about. It comes out as this tiny little thing. So that is a huge sheet of bubble wrap laid out in my sunroom at my old house. And a couple of the garment seams were sewn in advance, and then I layered the wool over it. So here it is in progress, and you can kind of get a sense for the chaos that is created by all of these layers of wool, and some of it, the fibers are silk. There's a layer underneath that is a sequined thread that just winds back and forth, so that as I felted, the sequins kind of emerged through the wool, and I get a little bit more sparkle like the stars. So it is mostly constructed in that one that you see. And then I actually towed it behind my car to do the felting. So it went onto a giant roller. I drove around the neighborhood. People kept stopping me. They're like, you're dragging something. It's literally 8 feet long and blue. Yes, I know. I'm dragging something. Indeed, I am. And now I will go cry in my room. Because when I had finished that whole felting process, it really didn't work at all. One of the difficulties that I didn't really think through is that when something shrinks, the material of it shrinks, and the holes expand. Okay, so the material shrinks, and the holes get bigger, which means your armholes, in particular, get bigger. So I had sleeves that were too small and too tight, with armholes that were much too large. And I thought, this thing is a complete disaster. What am I ever going to do? It is ruined. I spent an awful lot of time and money and my creative energy on this. And it's just, yeah. So shoulder fitting is really hard. It just is. We often think of bust fitting as being quite difficult, and of course the bust and the shoulder area are in conjunction in some ways that make certain kinds of fitting to be very difficult. And I had been inspired to do this by reading a couple of books on felting that had pictures of these beautiful, all felted in one jackets and coats. When I started looking at those pictures more closely after I reached this stage of the process, I looked at them and said, all of the shoulders on them have been altered. I could see the stitching. I could see the pleats that the artists had made to get the shoulder fitting right. And I was like, you told me this was felted in one, but they too were revising. They just didn't say that. Possibly because of that sense that I will go cry in my room, I have failed. Instead of thinking, oh, I have reached the next stage. How do I conquer this particular obstacle? Sometimes I feel like the protagonist in my own story. The basic plot line for commercial fiction is a sympathetic character overcomes great odds to achieve a worthwhile goal. So I'm trying to be a sympathetic character, and now I am up against great odds. Will I achieve a worthwhile goal? Let's find out. So this other sketch here shows some ideas of what to do now that the original plan has not worked. I start thinking about how to use the felted pieces that I have. How can I remake this? How can I re-envision it to become a successful garment? So I started making sketches about that after I had left it alone for a while. And this is the finished piece, which actually was juried into the Convergence Fiber Arts fashion show a few years back. I think I am happier with this than I would have been with the original garment. It's got a lot more movement, a lot of different shapes. It sort of brings out that sense of fire. I brought in that hand-dyed orange silk fabric underneath. I had a couple of buttons that I thought were perfect for it, but only a couple. So I got my husband to make castings of them out of resin. So we were able to make enough buttons to go down the front. And then the belt buckle, also at the Hollis Flea Market, I found a belt buckle that was perfect, except it was metal. So it would have been way too heavy to put onto a silk and wool garment. But my husband made a mold of that too. So, as I said, my family will keep coming. Josephine is a piece that was directly inspired by a book. The book is called The Stress of Her Regard. The author is Tim Powers, and he was the guest of honor at one of the big literary conventions that I was going to. So I wanted to do something in the Masquerade, which is sort of a staged fashion show for cosplay and costuming, that would honor my enthusiasm for his work. So The Stress of Her Regard is a vampire novel that involves the romance poets, including Lord Byron. So it's kind of wacky, as you might imagine. And the Josephine dress, when I completed it, came in 3 layers. There's sort of a basic underlayer, which is a classic ladies' day dress of around 1809. And then the next layer, I think I have a picture of, so I'll show you that. And then this coat style on the top with these kind of star-shaped puffy sleeves. So there's the coat, which is velvet. It's entirely hand-dyed with a lot of over-dyeing. I think I dyed it 3 different times. So I dyed it, I actually removed some of the color and then added color back in again to get it where I wanted it to be. That entire train for the steampunk bridal gown fits underneath the coat. It's about 30 layers. It's a combination of silk habitai on the bottom layer, and then I think it was a silk gauze on the top. Both layers printed with gears, and then I peeled the 2 layers apart and turned them around so that the gears appear to be interacting more. And there's a magnet in the train so that it magneted to the back of the coat. I don't have a video of this performance, but when I walked across the stage, I took the coat off and dropped it. And because of the magnets, when I dropped the coat, it pulled the train out behind me to kind of unspool the train of the dress. But then the question is, what do you do with this? Like, again, I've spent a lot of time and money, and now I have performed on stage in it for literally 1 minute. And I don't want to just sort of leave it hanging in my closet. So I took the train off, the 20 yards or so of fabric that we're kind of trailing after, made the dress a little bit more manageable. And yes, one of the samples that you have there is actually one of my test samples. I thought, oh, I could felt over this hand-painted piece of fabric and make something else. So I made this steampunk mini dress, which is being modeled here by one of the librarians, Emily, at the Bedford Public Library. For a while they did a fashion show because there's a group of very active knitters there. So they wanted to show off their knitwear. And I said, well, can I come? And they're like, what do you do? It's hard to explain. But it'll be fun, trust me. So Emily kindly modeled this piece because I had a couple of other pieces in the show. So Mountain Home, I talked a little bit about earlier. Mountain Home was inspired by these very lightweight viscose rayon scarves that the national parks are selling at their gift stores. So each one is a map of the national park that you're visiting. The little corner that you see here is Yosemite. Most of the scarves that I used are Rocky Mountain National Park because I think of that one as my sort of backyard park. We have a family cabin out there that belonged to my great-grandfather from when he was told that his wife's lung condition would do better with mountain air. So he bought a piece of land and built this cabin that remains in the family to this day. So when the theme for the Convergence Fashion Show was announced, and it was Seasons of the Smokies, because it was in the Smoky Mountains, I thought I could probably sneak this in there. They won't know the difference between the Rocky Mountains and the Smokies, right? So what you see is the reverse side of one of those map pieces with the wool layers starting to be laid out. And you can see I picked out the streams and the lakes in blue so that they would kind of show up. One of the things I liked about using Nuno felt for this particular inspiration is that I could get that sort of craggy geometric or geographic feel to the finished piece of fabric. So this is a piece in progress. As I said, I fitted the shoulders first. There's sort of a point at the back of your neck. If you tip your head down, you can kind of feel that little bump. When you're measuring the back length of a garment, that's where you measure from. That's essentially the point on your body that garments hang from. And we don't think about it necessarily because a lot of the garments we wear are pretty square. We have t-shirts, right? We have sort of some relatively basic kind of boxy shapes that we tend to just drape over ourselves. But in order to get the mountain ranges to work out the way I wanted, I thought, well, I have to start at the top, at that point on the body. So I felted all of the scarves individually, and then I started looking at the corners of them, which had all these really cool irregular shapes. Then those became my mountain range. Some of the mountains are with the map side facing out, and some of them are with the felted side facing out, depending on the shape and the texture. So this is one that is entirely hand-stitched, because in order to preserve those various shapes of the mountains, I needed to be very careful about where the stitching lines went. And there it is as a finished piece. So you can see the mountain range kind of wrapping around in the back. And I pulled out some cool little buttons from my button stash. This piece won honorable mention in the Convergence Fiber Arts fashion show that it was entered into. So I was super happy. I think this piece benefited from a lot of the problems that I had had with earlier works, especially Starborn, where I was like, you know what? Let's not try and felt that whole sort of bust and arm line area. Let us instead cut that and fit it after the felting process is done. So now I'm looking for a new inspiration. My son especially was really into the Amulet books. These are graphic novel series. They feature, some of the characters are animals, and some of them are elves, and this is like an awesome jumping off point for any kind of fantasy, right? So my kids wanted to dress up as a couple of the characters for Halloween. There is my daughter as the elfin prince, and my son as the assassin who was meant to kill her. So when I was casting about for a new kind of wild, crazy fantasy costume idea, I was a little more ambitious. This is a walking house. After all, it's my fantasy. So this is an ad showing the walking house that actually was in the New York Times when the 7th book in the series was coming out, and it was really nice because it's, this is a full-page newspaper ad, which was a lot easier to work from than any of the little pictures that were in the book. Here's a work in progress. You can see my editorial assistant, Diana, is also the home inspector. I guess somebody got a new microwave because it's a microwave box. The Quaker Oats box that you see in the middle there is actually a stamp that I'm making so that I can roll out brickwork. So there's me inside, taking over the great room, which is our maker space at home. One of the things that I thought was important about the house is that it lights up. It has eyes that are illuminated, and that's kind of like the headlights as the walking house is moving around through its fantasy world. And then I wanted it to look welcoming, so I had made this tiny little door there. So there are lights that go through the windows and then also above the tiny little door. My daughter was in the audience, so they recorded the video for me. I called the performance Walking Home. And this is sort of cheating in terms of bringing magic outside of the fantasy novel. The audience there is the Eregia Science Fiction and Fantasy Convention in Boston. And many of them were familiar with the books, so they got super excited when I came out. And it's a pre-recorded soundtrack that I went online and I found some sound effects. And I think it was, footsteps on concrete floor or something, footsteps on warehouse floor. So when my daughter was small, I had conceived the idea of doing an Ent wife from The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And in Tolkien's conception, the Ents are these tree people, tree shepherds, he calls them. and they are kind of wild and craggy. And the Entwives, who have gone missing, are elegant, refined. So the Entwives are kind of the garden, whereas the Ents are the wilderness. And this is one of the reasons why they can't really stay together. They have irreconcilable differences. And it's kind of a tragedy. If you read The Lord of the Rings, there are these amazing Ents that you meet that become battle partners for the hobbits and the other characters in the books. But they keep asking everyone they haven't met, or every species they haven't seen before, if they have seen the Entwives anywhere. And nobody has, because the Entwives left and we don't know where they went. So I thought it would be fun if I did an Entwife as Tolkien had conceived them, which is a very Victorian sort of lady. So this is a very Victorian silhouette. My original sketch, and then something a little bit more detailed. So, and they're still tree people, so I wanted to make sure that I had branches and leaves and vines. And I was going to do this for the LA World Science Fiction Convention. So then my husband goes, oh, I kind of want to go too. I said, will you be an Ent with me? He's like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I want to do this Entwife, and just look at it this way. My books were coming out. Think of it as a big free promotional opportunity, because everybody will be talking about it for the rest of the weekend, right? So he was like, oh, okay. And since at that point we had a daughter who was about this high, maybe you can see where this is going, and I had already conceived of the dress as having a bustle, we hid her underneath. Now, my mistake was that I didn't tell the tech crew who was doing the recording that there was going to be a reveal. The poem that you're going to hear for the performance is read by my husband and I. It actually comes directly from The Lord of the Rings, and I call the piece Reunion. So this is the MC for the performance.
The Lord of the Rings lingers so long in the mind, are the stories left unfinished, the moments we may yet witness in a distant time and place.
When spring unfolds the beechen leaf and sap is in the bough, when light is on the wildwood stream and wind is in the brow, when stride is long and breath is deep and keen the mountain air, come back to me, and say my land is fair.
When spring is come to garth and field, and corn is in the blade, when blossom like a shining snow is on the orchard laid, when shower and sun upon the earth with fragrance fill the air, I'll linger here and will not come, because my land is fair.
When summer lies upon the world and in a noon of gold, beneath the roof of sleeping leaves the dreams of trees unfold. When woodland halls are green and cool and wind is in the west, come back to me, and say my land is best.
When summer warms the hanging fruit and burns the berry brown, when straw is gold and ear is white, and harvest comes to town, when honey spills and apple swells, though wind be in the west, I'll linger here beneath the sun, because my land is best.
When winter comes, the winter wild that hill and wood shall slay, when trees shall fall and starless night devour the sunless day, when rain is in the deadly east, and then in the bitter rain, I'll look for thee and call to thee, I'll come to thee again.
When winter comes and singing ends, when darkness falls at last, when broken is the barren bough and light and labor past, I'll look for thee and wait for thee until we meet again. Together we will take the road beneath the bitter rain. Together we will take the road that leads into the west, and far away we'll find the land where both our hearts may rest.
Afterwards, when we come off the stage, they have a professional photography area where people who are covering the event for media outlets can come and take your picture. And then they have a fan photography area where fans can just hang out and they can take pictures. So we had about a gazillion million pictures taken. And we had to get special permission from my daughter to be on the stage because she was under the age limit at which they were supposed to let people on. So she really needed to go to bed. And I said, well, thanks so much for being on the stage with me. Did you like that? Yeah, I like that. That's great. You liked being on stage? No, I liked being famous. So the 3 costumes all incorporate some of the same materials. Ed's costume is made out of principally these sort of weird corduroy and some like home deck type materials. It's very rugged. I over-dyed them so that the pattern still comes through, but they were more sort of brown and woody looking. And then incorporated more, I had sort of a more smooth, sleek fabric that I chose for the main parts of my gown. And then of course Laurel as the enting. So hers is kind of more like birch bark kind of thing, but then with the trailing pieces that, and it's all edged with various kinds of crazy yarns to add more texture. My husband has an extra branch on his shoulder, and at the top of that branch there is a bird's nest, which when I finished dyeing all of the fabrics, and then I ran them through the washer and dryer, when I cleaned my lint trap, this big crazy wad of yarn and like the edges of the fabric had frayed and just all of that stuff all together, and it was like, it kind of looks like a bird nest. So it became one, and he has shelf mushrooms also. So some thoughts to linger with as I wrap up here. As you're considering your creative projects, whether you're writing stuff or maybe gardening or maybe quilting or pottery or photography, I think of it as the well that fills itself. What are the things that really inspire you, and how can you get more of that? And maybe it's a subscription to a magazine that you just get for the pictures. Or maybe it's visits to museums. I get a lot of my inspirations that way. I also like going to dance performances. Just anything that gets you excited and thinking in a more creative way than you do in your daily life. And don't forget to play. Once you have that material, those sources of inspiration, mess around with it. Maybe you make photocopies and you stick stuff on your wall. Maybe you're a Pinterest person and you gather all of your images online and you put them on your Pinterest board, and that's where you keep your inspirations. But keep them close and let them pile up. And that is often the fertile ground from which your ideas will spring. What's your fantasy? What is the vision that you have for yourself or your creative work? And how will the choices that you make as you create things or as you live your life help you to achieve that? And then what is the heart of this work? What's the most important thing? The reason that you went into creating this. Maybe it's a baby blanket for a family member, or maybe it's a pair of slippers to keep somebody warm. What are the most important aspects of that, and how can you make choices as you create that will help you to honor that heart? Any questions?
What's the most difficult work, fabric material that you've worked with, and that you would say, I will never do that again?
So, are you familiar with the Little Iguana company locally? I actually made their original mascot costume. They have a different one now. But the material we could find that was closest to the color that they wanted and the properties that they wanted was double-sided, so it was sort of deep green on one side and then it was blue on the other side, and it was sort of rubberized. And oh my God, that was just dumb. It was terrible. When my mother and I were sewing together, doing the original design stuffed animals for Curious Characters, we had a rule that if you broke 5 needles, you got to go home. Done. 5 needles or 1 tool. If you broke your seam ripper or any of those other things, no, you could just go home right then. So yeah, some days we called it early because of materials like that were just so hard to work with. And I do have the industrial sewing machine, which definitely helps, but sometimes sometimes there's just not enough help.